Welcome to Campus Ministry today. I am Steve Shadrack, and I'm with my friend and partner in ministry, Paul Wieser. It's been so encouraging to hear reports of how God has been using these episodes to equip and inspire leaders in evangelism and disciple making and mission mobilization, the infamous EDM. And so we pray that God will ignite a vision for nothing less than reaching the whole campus and the whole world for Jesus Christ through our times together. And that's one reason that we are hosting our first ever conference. We're actually calling it EDM, Evangelism, Disciple Making, Mission Mobilization. It's May 8th through 11th this next year in Fort Worth, Texas. And we are bringing in the best of the best. No celebrity Christians, but only practitioners that are really engaged in those kinds of ministries themselves. One thing we love about this event is that we have such a wide variety of networks and denominations and all stripes of collegiate ministry leaders represented at this conference. And so we're going to have every major campus-based network represented there, significant church-based ministries. One of them, the leaders we're going to interview today, collegiate church planting networks, campus-based, all kinds of folks. Over 700 leaders already signed up. And we're praying for 1,000, aren't we, Paul? So go to campusministry.org to register today. And like I mentioned, one leader who will be joining us at EDM, who inspires us to dream bigger for the cause of the gospel, is our friend Keith Wieser. And so, Paul, we're excited to have him, honored to have him. Introduce Keith to us today before we start throwing questions at him, if you would, brother.
Awesome. It's my honor to introduce Keith, and I got my Resonate Church hoodie on. I'm a huge fanboy of Keith and the ministry that they have going on. So from Keith's bio, it says he's originally from the nation of Texas. And so that's, of course, Texans are very proud of their heritage there. And his family, Keith and his family, have lived in the Northwest doing collegiate ministry for over 20 years now. And after completing seminary in 2004, Keith and Paige moved to Pullman to minister to college students, and in the process, they started Resonate Church. Since then, Resonate Church has multiplied into a movement of God that has, with 15 locations, reaching multiple college campuses and mainly focused on reaching college students. They've seen thousands of students transformed by the gospel and sent out all over the world. And now they have a large team of 70 plus staff or so laboring to advance the gospel on some of the most difficult campuses in the nation. And so in the process, they're kind of innovating fresh ways to reach students, build them up in the faith, and send them out on mission. They're almost like the guinea pigs of what's happening in the rest of the world. And so a lot of people are looking to them to learn what's coming next. So along with serving as a lead pastor at Resonate Church, Keith is a church planting catalyst in the Northwest, helping discover, develop, and deploy church planners. And as God has expanded the story of what God's doing at Resonate, he's also had opportunities to train, coach church planners, and coach and consult with collegiate leaders. And so he's like a household name among collegiate leaders. They want to hear what Keith is saying. And Keith also makes time to enjoy the outdoors with his family. He's got 3 kids, and he loves cycling long bicycle rides. It doesn't sound fun to me, but I'm sure it is enjoyable in its own way. Man, thanks for joining us, Keith. Can you share a little bit about how you came to Christ and how you got involved in collegiate ministry?
Yeah, man, I believe in myself more after you say all that stuff. I'm like, yes, man, okay. On hard days, I just need Paul, like, just helping me out there. So
I'll be your high man.
Dude. That's right. Hey. Oh man. So I grew up in like you said, in Texas, and my dad was a vocational minister. And really my story of coming to Christ was a very, very old practice called visitation. So someone shows up at a church, and then the ministers go to their house unannounced typically, and then just show up. And so this couple had come to our church, little bitty town in East Texas, town of 300 people. So they show up to the church, and my dad goes and visits them, and he shares Christ with them. And I'm going along with him because, this is the 80s, and, you just bring your kids wherever you go. There's nothing at home that's any more exciting. And so I think he promised me a Coke. And so anyway, I'm going along with him, and I just hear him share the gospel. And I get in the car with him and I say, Dad, I think I want to do the thing where you ask Jesus in your heart. And so we pull along on the side of a, dusty East Texas road, and he Christ. And so I think that's indelibly marked in terms of watching him live missionally and then being a product of that myself. And so that essentially started that journey. And I was raised in the church, but I don't think that I ever understood really what a non-programmatic life in Jesus was. So I was involved in all these things, and these things were intended, to grow you. And yet it could be really easy to be a participant and yet not be transformed, not have something that really got into the depth of my sin for Christ. And so I got into college, and I had this really significant moment where I could go this way or that way. And I had a guy reach out to me, and he invited me to like his house and to this bonfire behind his house. And I got there, and there were all these guys that were a part of these like key leadership positions across our campus. And they're sharing about their sin and confession and their desire to live towards Christ. And that was the first time I really had ever seen transformative leaders being, processing their sin, wanting to know Christ and be like that. And I was like, okay, that's what it means to be a disciple. And so that was that first moment for me. And then really, it was a moment where I'm walking across campus, and I'm asking God, okay, I need to figure out what my major is. I don't know what I need to do with my life. And he says, look around at what is happening here. All these people are in these places where they're asking questions about what they should do in their life, but they're not asking me. I want you to be pointed towards helping them to ask me that question. Wow. So that was this moment for me that really began to point my trajectory towards college students.
Wow, I love that. I can relate to some of that. Keith, what town in East Texas, by the way?
A little town called Nacogdoches.
Stephen
F. State University.
No, I'm very familiar with the town and the campus and everything. I grew up in Dallas. And what campus did you go to out of high school?
So I went to Alvin High School. It's south of Houston.
Oh, okay. And then, but what college did you then attend?
Stephen F. Austin State University.
Okay, in Nacogdoches. Okay, I got the connection now. Yeah. Well, brother, it's great to have you. I remember walking across campus myself and feeling like I had kind of a divine revelation as to what God wanted me to do with my life. So I think we may have some similar stories there. I came to Christ right at the end of my senior year in high school. Not through my dad, but through, FCA and Athletes in Action and things like that. But I want to go back to the early days of your time in Pullman, Keith, if we could, and kind of the birth of the Resonate Church. That's always been fascinating to me. Tell us a little bit about the Resonate, or how it originated and the highs and lows, really, of how God birthed that movement. Fill us in for a little bit, if you would.
Well, the journey is a journey of multiple people being a part of this, not just me, but I'll tell you my journey. And it really started as a 22-year-old in senior in college, and really asking, okay, if you're calling me to give my life to college students, what should that look like? And I had an option to be able to be on staff at a church in Dallas. There's an opportunity in Atlanta. And then there was this little opportunity up in the Northwest, and I'm at a worship event for college students there. I just feel like there's really clear thing that he wanted me to go to seminary, to go up to the Northwest and be a part of a church that looked radically different. And I didn't realize what that meant, because I'd never seen a church plant. I'd seen church splits. I'd seen a few of those, right? That was the Southern church planting in the 80s, right? In the 90s, essentially we started new things because we couldn't get along. So anyway, that was this place where I didn't want to do that, but that was really aimed me up to the Northwest. We got up to the Northwest, and I remember having a moment where this calling was back in the back of my mind, and it wasn't until a time that I was at a college football game. So it was I don't know, somewhere like 2005. I'm at a Oregon versus Washington State University football game, and I just have a moment where it's not a huge stadium. It's one of the smaller stadiums in the Pac-12, but I turn around and we're sitting there among all the students, and I turn around and I'm like, this is our mission field. And it's like you might not see more than 200 or 300 students on a typical walk through campus, right? But this was a place where there was, 25,000 students there in the stands. And I began to ask the question. There was something that began to just ask, are we doing what we need to do to reach every student here? Like, to be able to have a vision that was as big as the gospel that we were proclaiming. So if we were to think about how powerful the gospel was, so we begin to ask, like, what would it take? What would it take for us to be able to re-understand kind of the box that we fit, the methodology? And so I began to ask these questions. What would it look like? What's the ecclesiological realities? What's the historical realities for us to be able to do this? And frankly, that was a season back in the mid 2000s where there was more flexibility in ecclesiology than there really had been in the past. And to be able to say we can have churches that fit specific demographics. That was the rise of the biker churches, like motorcycle rider, like the things like cowboy churches. Those began to proliferate. And if we look back at that, there's all these things that are happening culturally, that are beginning to say, hey, let's begin to disrupt. So right around that time, the idea of disruptive things, and not that we were trying to be disruptive, but to be able to say you can rethink things. And so we were able to ask a few questions. And I think that God put his hand on a few leaders to be able to say, let's try it. And so in 2007, we started the process that now is Resonate Church. And we begin to see some significant response to that. And I think that was helpful in that season. We don't expect that sometimes from our churches now. That was helpful in that season to be able to say, hey, this is valid when it needed to be proven as a paradigm.
I love how you started with that big vision. I always say that the size of our vision should reflect the size of our God and the size of our mission. And so, man, we need to not settle for anything less than that. And you're a great example to me of that. But it didn't start with like all the amazing highlight reels that we see now and epic videos. I remember our first event at Chico State, starting our ministry. It was, I claim it as the lamest event in the history of college ministry. But actually, I heard of a story you share one time. We might actually be rivals here on this claim to fame of the lamest event. You want to tell us about that event? And if you remember the one at the house there, and tell us kind of how that full circle story. I love hearing that story.
Yeah, that's really, really important, because I think that sometimes anything that's proclaimed as a success, and if you're in the trenches right now trying to figure this out, like, you got to realize that it's a lot more likely that it's just continuing to do the thing that God has called you to do, even if the results don't yet bear the promise given. And that's way more important than trying to figure out how to have lightning in the bottle or the silver bullet. So one of the stories we tell is really, Paige and I get to campus, and we're there, and we know that freshmen are the place we need to put our focus on. And so we spend all week on campus, and we are trying to talk to students. We're trying to share what we're about and what we're doing. And we have all these conversations. And in our minds, we think that everyone who we have interacted with is an immediate, I'm all in, yes. And so by the end of the week, we know that is increasingly not the case, but it wasn't the case years ago as well. So anyway, we have this opportunity to be in this frat house, and this frat has gotten kicked off of the campus for violations. And the caretaker of this house is also one of our leadership team members. And so we're just like, this is incredible. What an open door. We have this massive house, and we're going to fill it with freshmen. And so we send out all of these flyers. We tell everybody we know about this event that's happening Friday night, and it's just going to be epic. And so we get everything ready there. And and it's we're going to start at 7, and at 7:15 2 people come, and then at 7:30 one other person comes,
Oh
and we're
boy.
just, oh, everybody's fashionably late, right? So this is how this works. By
No.
about 7:45 we're going to realize this
Oh
is
man.
and and so we have
Oh.
three people that are there, and I remember I'm interacting with them, and then I go and I'm like, where's my wife? And Paige is in the back steps, and she's just sitting there crying, and she's like, this is not how it was supposed to be. We left a vibrant ministry in the Portland area to come do this because we knew the guy was calling us to do this, and it seems like we just took a huge step backwards. And that was one of those moments that we had to say, do we want to do what's easy, or do we want to do what God's called us to do? And the cool thing about that is one of those three people, it was a young lady, and she ended up being a part of our ministry, being a part of our church plant. And her youngest brother is a guy named Colin Luoma. And because of her being a participant in this, he comes to Resonate Church. He's discipled. He's raised up in leadership. And he goes out and plants a church at Western Oregon University. And then he plants another church at Oregon State University, which just had a huge win over Oregon not too long ago. So it's a big deal. But anyway, this is this cool thing when you begin to see just that moment seeded something that was a guy who planted 2 churches in the future. If we'd have given up on that, there was some stuff that God might have done very differently. So it's really cool. So over the last 15 years, we started in Washington State, began to do a multi-site over at University of Idaho, which is only 8 miles. So we went multi-state, and we just talk about, how big of a deal it is, but it's just 8 miles. And then what happened is we just began to have this leadership development thing happen, and we began to recognize this engine from the college campus begin to help us develop leaders. And we made a conscious decision about 2012 that we didn't want to necessarily just keep adding, but to be able to figure out what multiplication looked like. And so we started planting additional services pointed towards additional types of people in 2012. And then 2014, we began to plant churches. And we've planted a church every year since that time, except for 2020 during COVID. And so it's been a cool thing to be able to see how God now has taken the seed of something, and then just we've tried to get out of his way to allow that to multiply. And as that has multiplied, we're really seeing something happen where it's not a plateau, but it's like this J curve of like exceeding our expectations the longer it is that we get away from that very beginning. It's been a really cool ride.
That's incredible. And I really resonate with your, no pun intended, I guess, with your story there. The first 2 students that we reached at Chico State are now our first planters starting a new challenge at UC Santa Cruz. And so while we're struggling over here with discouragement, God's calling and raising up the next generation of leaders that are seeing incredible fruit. And so hopefully that encourages some of our listeners that are struggling through those early days of getting a movement going. And now I want to just, before we move on to some more specifics here, think about the history of Resonate, and what were some of the key paradigm shifts or principles that were kind of like breakthroughs for y'all as you think about the history of Resonate?
Yeah, that's really key. I would say that one of the things that has been key in our last 15 years is that we keep trying to reinvent ourselves. And so we have a whole document on these things that shifted. So we have all these shifts that we've made, and I think that that's made it challenging. One of the things that, especially for people who've been around for a while, but with students, you have this perpetuating new kind of class, and they come into whatever that reality is, and they just assume that's the way it's always been. So we have a student that comes in today, and they're like, I guess you guys have always planted churches. I guess this is from the very first day, and they don't realize that. But I think some of that we started off with really trying to say, we're just trying to be relevant. And so that idea of just trying to be relevant was our first moment. And then we realized that, you know what, it seems like you can be relevant and actually miss being evangelistic and being making disciples. So you can have this whole thing that begins to revolve around a worship gathering. So we begin to recognize, oh my goodness, we can't do this if we're not creating community. And so there was a shift from that to be able to say, okay, we've got to figure out how something happens outside of the program, that these relationships that begin to be built. And so that began to shift what we did in terms of our focus. And then we began to recognize, man, we can build something that's relevant, and we can build this community, but ultimately we can lack being able to point our eyes beyond our group. And we begin to focus on evangelism. We begin to have these things that we begin to, from the very beginning, or not maybe from the very beginning, but to be able to say there's got to be more than just being a relevant voice, capturing people in the community. We have to aim outside of ourselves. And then we begin to recognize some realities around the difference in addition versus multiplication. And we begin to say, hey, what does it look like to make disciples that make disciples that make disciples? And really being able to understand that that's more of a paradigmatic change than it is just a tactical change. You have to understand about what you're trying to do in a significant way. And I think those are some of the massive things that we've been trying to figure out, how those paradigms shift, and to be able to think the way you think about multiplication almost undoes everything that you did to be able to get to addition. And so, so that's been one of the most challenging things, is being able to say, it might be better for us to, for a time, get smaller so that we could get exponentially bigger. And that's really hard, because in the very beginning, it looks like losing. It looks like things that are going not up and to the right, but are going down as you begin to figure out, that Jesus had these moments. We go back to this, this Gideon thing, that we begin to see that it's not always up and to the right in the economy of Jesus. And so there was those moments, at the cross where everybody abandons Jesus, and you begin to figure out, what does it look like? One of the things that I say to our people is, it seems like 500 people saw Jesus in his resurrected state, but the church is numbered at about 120, which means that there was people that saw the most incredible thing, that saw a man that had come back from the dead and said, no, thank you. Wow. And so whatever we're doing is going to be this reality that there's something that captures their heart, and it doesn't matter what we're doing to be impressive. If God doesn't capture their heart, then this won't be able to multiply in the future. So some things that we saw.
The stories you two men tell about your start, I was remembering back as I was a college pastor myself, Keith, in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And my wife and I wanted to start a ministry to the Greeks on our campus. And so we started a campus-wide Greek ministry in our home, in our living room. And we had 3 girls and 1 guy that took turns coming to the weekly meeting, and with emphasis on took turns coming, but we kept going. And within a year, the thing had exploded to the point where we were averaging 600 Greeks. Every single week, we would take every stick of furniture out of fraternity and sorority houses week by week as we were going around campus with the main event. And so if we had given up when it looked so bleak, so embarrassing, and so small, God would have never had the chance to create really a kind of a campus-wide movement among the Greeks. So anyway, there's something to be said for starting small, going deep, persevering, praying like crazy, going after key students who could very well provide breakthroughs for you, on that campus. And that sounds like what you and Paul both have done. So I think we can commiserate with our early days, but then see God do some amazing things as a result. So I love it, Keith, that your church is really shamelessly focused on reaching college students. And so, for those that are watching or listening to this podcast, we have, several thousand that listen or watch this each year and on a monthly basis. But for them, they're prioritizing college students. But reinforce that. Why have you chosen over the years to prioritize college students? What would you say to that question?
You're going to get me hyped up here. This is what we talk about, the pearl in the field. If we go back to that thing, obviously that's talking about the gospel, but this discovery of this thing that you would say, I will sell everything to be able to gain this thing. I think that is the level of strategic priority that college students should be given that frankly aren't given to this across our world. So even I was looking at some Gallup research and just talking about after the age of 29, you have about 7% of people that decide to follow Christ. So 93% are before the age of 29.
Wow.
You see the marriages and mortgages create stasis. And so if you're not moving or you don't have a crisis in your life, it's unlikely that you're going to have a moment to be able to break out of your routine and to be able to have the transformative. And I'm not talking affiliation, like I grew up in church and just kind of moved away from it. I'm talking about this thing like I don't have a worldview of Jesus, and now I'm entering into that. So Rodney Stark talks about that is true conversion, as a Baylor sociologist. But instead of like the reaffiliation, so I'm coming back, so I've been dechurched and coming back to church. I believe that that is, and if I think that 29 is even just one of those statistical containers. I think it's all the way back to the 24, 23. And so if we think about that, this is that moment as they go and they leave oftentimes their place of development and they go to college. We see like neurologically, there's this formation that happens. It's almost the equivalent of the first 5 years of life that happens in those college years. We think about what that looks like when you insert the gospel into those places and trajectories are formed. And we think about, like, I love going into rooms and talking to people and say, all right, where were the most significant decisions that you made to get into this room? And it's almost always back in those years.
Yeah.
And so if we think about how we can actually help transform the world, transform the church, it is the college experience. So the idea of they come into this place and it's one of the most open moments of their life for the gospel, for the community, all those things. And we think about the ability for them to create habits, their availability to be discipled. One of the things that we've struggled with in post-college is like when you have a family and when you have a full-time job, the amount of hours that you can put into this is just highly limited. So you have that availability, you have the opportunity, you have the sendability, and so that is so key for us. And the other thing, this is focusing on the college context keeps the church young. It keeps the church relevant. It allows us to see what is coming in the future. And you don't even have to be good at it. Like you just have to be around it. And you just are going to, at some point, be able to understand what's happening next. So that's the stuff that I'd say this is why if we don't do this, we're just dumb. So
well, you're a pioneer in my book, Keith, and I'm thinking of the Hope Church movement. I'm thinking of Ed King with the Grace Point. I'm thinking of Salt Network, and there are just several significant collegiate church planting networks across the United States. And a number of y'all are coming to this EDM conference next May, which we're thrilled about. So I do see a trend, an exciting trend towards churches taking a real strategic interest in the college campuses. And it's not just a come to us to hear our great preacher emphasis. It's a go to them strategy. We're actually targeting this campus, and I appreciate all the other campus ministries that are trying to reach that campus. But we as a local church, we also have a strategy, and I just love that. But why do you think more churches, even in these college towns across the United States, are not focusing on college students? They are so strategic. We all agree on that. But why do some kind of neglect to do that, do you think, or choose not to do that?
Yeah. Yes. That's a challenge. So this might be a hot take on a few things. One, I think that it's the reality that we have to come and we can recognize that college students do not provide resources. And I think one of the most significant, subtle vision creating things resources. And I've seen over and over churches that had a vision that was manipulated by the amount of resources that they needed, had. And so if you remove the economic drivers and just ask, what should the church be about? What's the most essential way and effective way to do that? I think that, we see from the very beginning, a lot of those economic drivers in the early church were removed in the ways that they worshiped. And I think that we're going to move back towards that way. But I think that the faster we can be able to say, we can't allow economic drivers to be vision drivers, even subtly. So I think that's number one. Number two is I think that there's a nuclear family as the driver. So when we think about, there's a strong priority that we have, or a strong tendency we have to prioritize our kids. And so every church that I've seen drift away, it's been essentially a group of people get into a place where they provide the resources, and those resources ultimately give them the power to be able to affect the methodology of the church. And as we think about methodology that's formed around a certain group of people, ultimately is subtly excluding other groups of people. And so if you remove the economic driver and you take away the tendency to prioritize our kids, you really get to those places. And so that's where we see, I don't know if you guys, especially when I'm in the South, I see University Baptist Church. It's right next to the campus, doesn't have a college student going to it, right? And you're like, that's not the way they started. But what we see is many churches, they drift away from college students, and maybe that's okay. We just need to be able to replant churches that begin that process again. And ultimately we can continue to do that. And the only churches that don't do that is the ones that say, hey, this is what we're about, and we're going to sacrifice these things. And so if you don't understand what you're not going to do as a collegiate church, or as a church that reach college students, then at some point you won't reach college students. And so that's what I think. I think it's really it's resources, and I think that families, again, both are essential. I'm not saying don't reach families, don't have resources, just be able to make your choices wisely.
Thank you for sharing those. And I know sometimes it's difficult to talk about some of those things, but I wrote a whole article, 5 reasons most churches don't reach college students, and it was some very similar things. Maybe we'll throw that in the show notes as well. But that's important. So now let's shift gears, talk about the planting churches on these new college campuses. Can you give us a little peek into the playbook, so to speak, that your teams use when they hit the campus, how they reach their first students, and how they go about establishing a church that reaches the campus?
That's great. So first of all, you use the word team, and I think that that's the key, and will continue to be the key. Is the team is how we do things, how we want to continue to do things. I think how Gen Z will, I think they'll move more towards team-based planting and team-based leadership. And so I think that's going to be the idea, is trying to figure out, how does that team get established? So let's say that team is established. That I just don't want to just blow by the fact that everything begins and ends with prayer. Like this has to be rooted in this idea that this just wasn't a good idea. This wasn't just an interesting technique. This wasn't just a cool strategy, but that at the very core of God's heart, this is the actions that he loves. This is the actions that is core to the church. And so with those two things established, I'll give you some strategy that we talk about. First of all, we say we sow broadly with excellent addition-based programming. We sow broadly with excellent addition-based programming. So we use the word addition to be able to separate this from just saying this is what it looks like. But we're trying to say we sow broadly. We're trying to figure out, how do we find people of peace? And so this is one of those things that probably looks similar to most things that you would see on a college ministry playbook. So we're doing things like house parties, we're doing tabling, we're doing things that are engaging them in athletics, like not like Frisbee, stuff like that. We're not like hardcore stuff, but like these are all these things that are those typical gathering things. So we're sowing broadly. What we're trying to say, this has got to be good. And It's got to be something that's desirable. I've been around so many things that I'm like, dude, I would not want to go, and I'm,
Right.
I would want to do that thing. Number two, we strive to rival the capacity of any organization on campus to create community. So if we begin to say, we strive to rival the capacity of any organization on campus to create community. So how is it that that Resonate Church is able to form a community that is more compelling than anything else? Right. And so when you begin to, what I want our teams to understand is, let's begin to say, an athletic team that does these things together, has these experiences together. They have camaraderie and they have purpose. Let's do it better than that. Let's look at what happens in the experiences of the Greek system and how those people are formed in this. Let's do it better. Let's figure out how to do it better. So what you're effectively doing is you're being able to say, let's not just have these things that are like, this is just what we do to create community. Let's think strategically on how people are actually formed together. So that's number two. Right. Wow. Number three, we identify those whose hearts are softened towards Jesus. So as we begin to say, okay, we're going to bring people together, we're going to create community, and then we're going to see who Jesus is actually doing something in their hearts. So like he's softening their hearts, so hopefully we're displaying what a gospel-centric community looks like. So there's Jesus that is in their midst as believers are interacting together. But we're really just trying to say, more than anything else, we believe that when believers act intentionally, God is also acting intentionally. The Holy Spirit is working intentionally. And so let us just find out who is actually moving towards this way. And sometimes this takes a bit. So I was talking to our planters in Salt Lake City, who are huge fans of your podcast. And they were just talking about how it's been looking like as they begin to navigate the LDS community there and stuff like that, to be able to figure out, what does it look like for us to be able to know who to say yes to and who wants to be here just because they don't have anything else to do, and to be able to figure out who's both influential and who is interested. And those two things really create a helpful thing. So number four, we disciple those who chose Jesus to transform their head, hearts, and hands to look like Jesus. So we begin to say, okay, who's interested? Let's move towards them in disciple making. And so this is that key piece to it. Number five, we teach those who are becoming like Jesus to own their space. So this is that moment where they begin to say, now that I'm following Jesus, what are the requirements on my life to be able to ultimately say yes to his mission and to be able to own my space. Whenever these are sequenced like this, you begin to see that natural progressive thing towards mission. And that's really, really helpful. And then our last piece to this, number six, we create structures and systems that allow for larger and larger groups of disciples to repeat the process effectively and efficiently. Good. So we're just trying to figure out, how do we scale this? So, so as we begin to go to a college campus, we're just running this play, and we're just being able to say, and this is not anything that's new necessarily. We're just trying to give a sequence to things, and to be able to say, don't leave this sequence before you get to that sequence, or this moment before you get to that moment. We just want to ensure that these are a flywheel. So I love the idea that Jim Collins has in Good Great. You do this will naturally lead to this. This will naturally lead to this. And so those are the kind of the six things.
Wow, those are pretty amazing. I feel like we need to be taking notes here, Paul.
Yeah. I'm glad we got this recorded. I feel like
I'm glad we recorded this, and there's nothing new. Some of the young bucks always ask me, what was it like to make disciples back in the Civil War, Shadrach? They're picking on me a little bit, Keith, but it also, I can't help but be thinking about one of my heroes that just passed away a couple of days ago. Paul, you know about this too, is Waylon Moore. And I don't know, he was certainly in his 90s, mid-90s, I think. And he was really a contemporary, a friend to co-labor with Dawson Trotman, the founder of the Navs, and co-labor with Bill Bright of Crew, of fellow laborer there as well. And these principles you were sharing, they're not new. God has raised up certain leaders in certain generations, Keith, to to take these biblical principles and to apply them, in this generation. And God blesses it over and over again. Anyone listening or watching this can take those principles, the power of the Holy Spirit, and see God do amazing work.
Right.
I was reviewing Robert Coleman's book and his 8 principles just a few days ago, and help me with the name, guys. Master Plan of Evangelism. And gosh, just basic, simple biblical principles that Jesus implemented. I guess we can too. Hello, and see what the Lord does. So anyway, some great advice from you, Keith. And it's just one critique, though, some forms of church planting over the years. I'm sure you've seen every critique there is to see. But sometimes churches, they start to grow and they mainly attract, disgruntled Christians, from other churches or other ministries, instead of reaching non-Christians. That's one of my definitions or characteristics of a movement versus just a ministry is, no, they're starting with and leading people to Christ. And so how do your teams avoid that trap, Keith, where, you're able to keep focus on reaching the lost on the campus as the top priority, not just having great sermons and cool worship that attracts reorganizing Christians type thing? How do you keep that as a real priority?
Yeah, that's really helpful. One of the things that goes back to our story, we did a thing. In fact, the name of our church came out of this process that we did called the Resonate Sessions. So we're trying to figure out, as we try to say, what kind of church would do well here. And so we basically sent out the word to all of our friends, everybody we had a relationship with, hey, come to these Resonate Sessions if you're interested. And so we had these 6 weeks of asking people about these things. And over those 6 weeks, we were spent the first part of discovery and the next part in terms of basically saying, this is what our church is about. And 0 of those people were a part of our church, not 0. And so when we launched, by the time we launched, no one who had come to those Resonate Sessions actually showed up on launch day.
Oh, man.
And I think part of that is because I think there's 2 different types of disgruntled people. One is people that have an expectation gap. So somehow they have this expectation of church. They have this idea of, this is what I expect, that there's an embedded ecclesiology from something in their past that creates some sort of an expectation. And so they say yes to some sort of paradigm. And oftentimes they're hurt or they're relationally immature. And so they're trying to find something else. And so the other types are people that I would call, there's a purpose gap. So instead of an expectation, there's a purpose gap. So they're not necessarily they're just something that it seems like the church isn't doing the right purpose. And oftentimes those are more external focus. Hey, this is who the church should be, versus the expectation gap is, this is who they should be towards me. And so the one thing I would say is, just don't recruit. If there's a church background, don't recruit them, vet them.
Yeah.
So being able to ask, what's your expectation? What do you expect of me as a pastor? What do you expect we're going to do? And the more you can get into that, typically we try to talk people out of our church. And if we can't do that, then they might be able to stick around. And whenever this is a mark of faith. I think that sometimes when people get to a college campus or trying to start something, and they feel like their thing is small, they're like, I just need more warm bodies. And those warm bodies will end up doing things that you never want them to do. Work against you. It's a very short-term process. Stay small with people who are part of a remnant you want to build around. And so oftentimes we have warm hearts towards people that bring their issues. But as a leader, on the very beginning, just be very careful about adding people in. So that's one of the things that we've done. Again, let me just go back to the economic model. If you have to figure out how to get people into your church to get paid or to pay the bills, it's really hard to say no to disgruntled people, because come in and they're articulating, man, we just want to come here and be a part of this thing. it's easy sometimes to be able to say, okay, this is somebody who will get me to this end versus ultimately the end. So,
well, I have a feeling a number of our watchers and listeners to this podcast, Keith, are really have some of the same fiber you have of kind of apostolic. You like to start something, you like to initiate, you like to plant something, and so I think all of us need to realize that the first 6 days, the first 6 weeks, the first 6 months, the first year or two, the forming of the DNA, who you focus on and how you focus on them, your core. Who did you go after for your core, and how did you build your core? Will say everything about the DNA of your church in 3, 5, 7, 10, 20 years from now, or ministry. And so how you begin and who you begin with, and plus is evangelism the cutting edge of what you're doing, that will really have great bearings on what your ministry looks like in the months and years to come. Is there a certain tool, Keith, as you're training? I'm going to turn the questioning over to Paul here in a second, but I'm just curious, is there, as you're training your student leaders how to share their faith, is it the bridge illustration? Is it the 3 circles? Is it the 4 laws? Or something you all put together yourself that it's something simple, practical that they can actually lead a friend to Christ?
Yeah. So that's the simple, practical, and then just hammer it home and don't ever stop doing that is the key thing. I've seen all of them be successful. I've seen people decide. So whatever tool it is, the key is to be able to say, use that tool, use it to the best of your ability. So we have 3 things that we've used. And to be honest, even in our 15 sites, there are a diversity of things that people use, and some of them they came out of something. Whatever it is that you're passionate about, stay passionate about that. So one of the things that we do is we do sometimes of a relational mapping, just to give people an understanding of who is in their life. And so being able to do that. So ultimately, you have to answer the who question. And then you have to begin to go through, and we have a thing called the missional living wheel. And the missional living wheel helps someone to map the kind of conversations that they're having, to be able to say, hey, this is general conversation. This is spiritual conversation. This is gospel conversation. This is asking the question of, do you follow Jesus? But just to be able to say, if we can give them a picture in their mind where they're at, to be able to say, I don't want to just stay here. I want to be able to ask, here's the next question I need to ask. Here's the way by which that we can begin to move ahead. And then 3 circles is one of the things that we use pretty consistently, just to be able to help people to be able to articulate the gospel.
Good.
And, oftentimes when they get to that, it's just helpful to have a tool to be able to go back to ensure that you don't get convoluted as you begin to articulate. So
that's good.
Yeah.
That's great. And I noticed that you didn't just jump to the 3 circles, because that's a lot of people. There's plenty of gospel presentations out there.
Yeah.
But what most students, or most people, Christians in general, struggle with is those first steps, building those relationships with non-Christians, and then building towards a spiritual conversation. And so that's kind of what we've seen in our training with collegiate leaders and students, is that it's that getting to the point of sharing the gospel is often the hardest part.
Yep.
And then if you just give them a simple tool, they'll do it. And so that's awesome. We're on the same page there. So let's shift to discipleship and disciple making. With the rapid growth of your church, how have you been able to provide discipleship and community for all these new believers? So can you tell a little bit about your disciple making culture, systems, strategies that you guys use?
Yeah, real quick, let me jump back to just one more thing to say in that last question. This is just, I think, confessionally on our part, but I've heard this enough across the nation that evangelism post-COVID has had some pretty significant shifts to it. And I know in our context, the zeal for evangelism has had to be very intentionally reconstructed. And that it's not there, that momentum just crashed for us. And I've heard some of those things that have happened again. So you begin to have some cultural headwinds. You begin to have some practical headwinds in terms of just how our habits were formed over COVID. And so I just think whatever it is, just continue to put the focus on evangelism, and it might need people more than we think, even post
Mhm.
COVID. So in terms of disciple making, was if we think about this, we begin to recognize that church planting was the kind of the thing that pulled disciple making to happen. So if we think about this, making disciples, moving them through a process, church planting was that lid that, as we began to remove that lid and to be planting churches, it really helped the process of disciple making. So oftentimes disciple making requires a vacuum to be formed for someone to move into it, to be able to say, there's space for me to disciple you. There's an opportunity for you to be able to grow in this. And so one of the things that we did was we began to say, we want to plant churches because ultimately that is a pathway to make disciples. So not the other way around. We don't make disciples so we can plant churches. Planting churches is not the end goal. Making disciples is the end goal. Jesus talked about making disciples, not planting churches. And so this is ultimately what we're trying to achieve, a disciple making process. And that disciple making process really allowed us to be able to form a shift from growing up and getting bigger, in addition to be able to say, we want to actually be multiplying. And because we think at the end of our lives, we'll be much more happy with the numerical impact of multiplication versus addition, even if we can't see it until later on in our lives. And so we've used this idea of a lake church versus a river church. So a lake church is, we collect everything kind of leads to this one location. A river church, doesn't make something as big, but it begins to navigate that to places that are much, much beyond ourselves, much further beyond ourselves. So we start by doing DTs. So one of the things that our friends at Grace Point just helped us to understand is the primacy of reading the Bible. And so you go back, and I don't know if you looked at research, like sharing the gospel and reading the Bible are these two things that are these maturing, are marks of maturity. These two things, if you do these two things, you're likely to be a mature believer in Christ. So, we basically just say, hey, we want you to read the Bible. We're going to give you these kind of tools and these kind of expectations. So start by doing DTs. As you begin to, the first thing that you get invited into in our church is to read the Bible with me. The second thing, as you begin to have a kind of a movement towards Jesus, is to be able to do a thing called the Grow Book. And the Grow Book is simply just a basics of the faith thing. And this is what starts so if you begin to say the relationship is formed around the Bible, and that begins to generate everything that is going to be in the future of the believer. So it all comes out of a biblical engagement. So then we begin to add this idea of, here's some specific ways that you can begin to grow through this Grow Book. And that begins to cement the idea of mentorship together. And then we bring other people around this into a thing called Huddle. And we took this from 3DM and Mike Breen. But essentially what we're trying to do is use the Bible to inform our decision-making around obedience. And so that's the thing that we want them to be able to say. It doesn't depend on this set of material, this curriculum. We really want you to go back to the Bible. But the thing that we want you to most understand is how to say yes to Jesus consistently, and to be able to do that throughout your life. And so that if we have a small amount of time, we want you to be able to get into the Bible and to be able to get the Bible into your decisions.
Paul, if Keith will allow us to include a couple of those resources he's mentioning in our show notes to share with our constituency out there, that those sound like some amazing tools.
Yeah.
And he's trying to keep it simple and basic and reproducible. I keep thinking about wash, rinse, and repeat. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Don't make it complex. Don't make it, overwhelming, so people will feel like they have the competence and skill to do it, on a moment's notice. There's so many questions we'd like to ask you, Keith. We're taking so much of your time here. I'm gonna skip down to one that I wanted to ask you about. We talked about evangelism and disciple making. That third letter of the EDM acronym we're kind of created there is missions mobilization. Keith, you have such an incredible opportunity to see really hundreds upon hundreds of graduates pursue strategic roles in God's global cause. So briefly, what does your church do to mobilize students towards God's global purposes and seek to step into them really as world changers. What would you share there?
Yeah, that's so key. As you think about what makes people have the experiences that transform their lives. Back in the late 90s, I spent a summer in Estonia, and that was one of those catalytic moments for me. And so if you think about Chip and Dan Heath, think about summer projects creating these power of moments.
Yes.
We look back, we started doing research on how people got to a place where they were planting churches, where they're engaged in multiplication, like all these things that we wanted them. And we reversed and said, okay, what were the experiences that they had? And two things. One is summer projects that they are able to have this thing. And the two is they went somewhere globally on a mission trip. So these two things were these common factors. Now, obviously there's other stuff that happened in that. It's not like if we do those two things, you're going to naturally have that outcome. But that global idea was one where I think that you begin to see something that's outside of your it's outside of your comfort zone. It requires you to lean deep into Jesus. It requires you to have a vision for what God's doing globally. And here's what I believe that it is strategic for, is it allows someone who says that the view of my life now feels small in light of what God is doing in the world.
That's
and
good.
so if
That's
you can
good.
help a student to feel small, then you're actually doing something that increases all of our worship, right?
That's a
So
good
we
point.
all desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And I don't think that's going to shift in terms of each generation. And so we're planting a church in London, because London is, we begin to say, okay, where does the world go to college? And we begin to say, what does it look like? We see all these places, people who are leading countries, and they go to London to be. So if we begin to say, this is what we believe about college, let's go ahead and go. So we have people that are right now in London on the backside of the break that we're in, being able to experience what it looks like, and that's what begins to ignite. If I can go to across the world, I can go across the street. I can go to some place that's drivable to my world.
I love it. Resonate Church going global. It's awesome. You've already had some work done in East Asia as well. And I remember seeing a spoof video years back where you guys on April Fools, you put out this really slick video and revealed you were going to go plant a church on Mars, and I love that. And maybe you'll still have to do that if Elon Musk pulls off his plans here. But so just keep that in your back pocket there, Keith. But yeah, love your vision and love that you guys are paving the way of sending out students and taking risks on students, even in their 20s, these younger planters. So that's a question I had. How do you coach and equip these younger planters as they're getting their, cutting their teeth on planting new churches?
Paul, it's one of those things where you have to embrace the successes and the failures. Like, you have to be able to say, man, this is going to be worth it for us in the long term. So how we do it, one is we try to figure out how to create the most opportunity for them to have, to have an opportunity, but then to be able to figure out how to do that without providing too many risks. So one of the things that we believe is that you learn best by doing stuff. Like, you just learn best by being able to have hands-on, by being able to say, I'm going to just actually do this. And so essentially doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing, if you can get them into that place, it allows them to learn those things. So our training is oftentimes go and do it. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to be in proximity to your life. You're going to have access. So we have a lot of things, and some of our leaders love it, and some of the leaders think, man, we just meet too many times, we have too many of these things. And so in that, what oftentimes happens is they have this loop of feedback. We have people around them that are spiritual directors in their life. We have cohorts that they're enabled to be around, and so then we have 120 staff, and we get them together regularly, and being able to have playbooks, being able to have models, being able to have coaches. I think that allows us to send. And I think that oftentimes we should ask, how early can we send out? Not what's the bar to get ready. I think, we look at what Jesus did, and it just seemed like these guys were not ready. These guys did not have anything but the Holy Spirit. And so he says, who am I going to give you? I'm going to give you a person, not a playbook. And so we try to figure out how we give them a person, and that person is really a network. And so we're trying to create a network that people can join, people can be a part of, because we feel like that's what ultimately is needed, as we can kind of point to the future and say, hey, this is what's going to be healthy for the church. It's a connected church. It's a networked church.
I think what you're tapping into there is really powerful, because younger leaders, they're zealous, they can relate well to college students, they can jump right into those relational networks, they can stay up late partying with, quote unquote partying, but don't quote me on that one. But they can have a great time, they can be in the mix. But then if they have some good structure and accountability and coaching, then they won't just crash and burn on whatever. So yeah, I think it's a great model that you have in taking risks on younger leaders, but also providing them the coaching and feedback and support and training that they need. So one last question before we get you to Shadow will kind of close us down here. We've had some fascinating conversations recently about some innovations or things you've noticed in leading Generation Z, and now we have another generation, I don't even know their name, coming up soon. What are some
double A? You start over with a double letter on the next time.
Okay,
It's the double A. It's like the double A batteries, you gotta,
Yeah. Okay. But what have you learned about kind of leading this generation, and what innovations are you foreseeing we may need to keep an eye on in the future?
Man, that's a great question. So I don't know if anybody knows exactly, but here's some things we're trying to look at. It feels like you're trying to see if you're in a boat, you have binoculars, you're looking at the horizon, you're trying to make out what you see. So one of the things I think is really clear is institutional suspicion. So you begin to have a significant amount of suspicion towards any kind of power differential. So anything that creates, power here, lack of power here, that is something that is just really challenging for Gen Z, and they see this in the world. So everything is kind of moving towards an equity, and so I think in terms of what the church looks like, okay, this is what's hard, is we have the greatest benevolent leader, right? We have a Heavenly Father who loves us and yet does not give us authority. And so, but the thing is, before you understand the benevolence of your Heavenly Father, what you see is an authority structure. You see that in the Bible, and then you see that played out in the church. You see, literally a guy on a stage, oftentimes with authority, speaking to people who don't have authority. And so, so in that, this is where I think that we have to have things that are more relationally connected. So, and that might mean that there's things that are smaller. That might mean that we can't have the same things that were just as, as big and broad as we had before. And so I would say we need to work to be able to be more relational, more connected. So here's what Gen Z will say oftentimes: hey, you can't tell me that unless you know me. And so we have to be able to work on that. And I think that actually is a fairly helpful thing for multiplication. Another thing is we have a sense of anxiety. So the decline of church, the decline of oftentimes structures that were consistent, institutions that were consistent in our world, has led to more anxiety. So institutions are anxiety absorbing things. And so what I tell our guys is, man, you are going to be increasingly an anxiety absorbing person in people's lives. And so one of the things we're working on with our guys is just being able to say, how does anxiety pass through you and not get lodged within you? Because we're seeing a lot of burnout from leaders who work with Gen Z, who are really getting a lot of anxiety and not knowing exactly how to deal with all that anxiety. So we see burnout that's happening from people that aren't working burnout kind of hours. And those kind of things, I think, go back to the kind of the emotional side of leadership. And so I think that being able to process through anxiety is going to be one of the key things that the future leaders are going to have, because you need to be an anxiety absorbing person. But man, you've got your own things in your life, and now you got their things. And so that's going to be a key element to that. And so we're seeing some things that happen from social anxiety that still are there. And so I hope that those are temporary. But we're also seeing a move towards more digital communication, and the way that works is creating a social immaturity. And so as we think about Gen Z, is just their ability to navigate conflict is lower. And so what's happening is you have more disposable relationships. And so, but the thing is, digital allows you to have more relationships. And so we're just having to coach people on how to have conflict. And so those are a few things that we're seeing. We go into probably a whole podcast on this thing. But we're seeing that in a significant way.
I love that. And I think your emphasis on team approach and community groups and things that can help absorb some of those socially awkward anxiety things, and also being okay with a level of that just occurring across the board. God, I've seen some really socially awkward people lead a ton of people to Jesus, myself sometimes included,
Yeah.
and so that's something that it's not necessarily a deal breaker, helping them move forward despite some of these anxieties and hang-ups and things. So yeah, Keith, would you close us in prayer, and then we'll close out the podcast here.
Yeah, absolutely. Lord, we are just thankful that as we talk through this, that your truth shines through. And so we just ask that more than anything that we would say of wisdom, Lord, that you would be speaking to those who are hearing this right now and letting them process through what their next step is, Lord, as we are aiming our lives towards the kingdom of God that you've created, Lord, and specifically what the kingdom of God looks like on the college campus. And so we ask, Lord, that there would be workers that we would call out, Lord, that you say, and the harvest are white and are ready. And Lord, we just pray that from this, there would be a rise in the passion for the next generation, Lord, as we think about the future of the church. And we ask, Lord, for a movement. We ask, Lord, that you would do things in this group of people, Lord, that seeds the seeds of a movement as we look to the future. So we thank you for the purpose that you've given us to be able to aim our lives at the next generation. In your holy name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Keith. And I know we could go a couple more hours here, so we'll have to bring you on again sometime. But thank you so much for your time. And I encourage all of our listeners to check out Resonate Church and the resources and just their model that they have. It's a great thing to learn from. And so that wraps up our session today, friends. Make sure to check out the rest of our resources at campusministry.org, and let Shad and I know how we can serve you, how we can help. And so until next time, God bless.